Out of the southern dark staggers a stag with one antler wound in grey web and 4 wounds already blackening on its flank. Thranduil reads the sign at a glance. The spiders of Mirkwood are breeding again, and this time they have crept too far north to be left alone. Ride south with the Elven King under blackened mail, and count the nests as he does, for their number is the whole of the danger. The first stag came north without its shadow. It broke from the fern dark beneath the beeches at dusk with foam hanging from its jaws, and 1 antler bound in grey web, and 3 guards loosed before they saw the mark upon its flank. Thranduil raised one hand, every bowstring held. The stag stumbled between the roots, struck its knees, and dragged itself the last few feet to the king's boots, its eyes white with terror. Behind it, the southern trees stood without birdsong. Thranduil knelt and drew the web from the antler between 2 gloved fingers. It clung like wet sinew. Black hairs, thick as thorn stems, were caught within it, and on the stag's hide lay 4 round wounds, each already darkening. The king touched none of them. He looked south through the ranks of trunks, where the last pale light failed beneath gathering cloud. "Close the western paths," he said. Galeon stood near with a drawn bow and glanced toward the stricken beast, asking how far, and the answer came without pause. To the Ashen Brook, no hunter passing south of it, no woodman going alone beyond the birches, word sent beneath the hills. The command moved at once. Horns did not sound. Runners slipped away under branch and root, grey-cloaked and swift, carrying the king's will toward halls, watchposts, and hidden dwellings. Thranduil rose while one of his guards ended the stag's pain with a narrow blade, and he watched the animal fall without turning his face. Night came early under Mirkwood. Before the moon had climbed, Thranduil rode from the forest gate with 30 of his household guard and 12 scouts who knew the southern reaches leaf by leaf. No silver shone upon them. Their mail was covered in dark leather, their helms wrapped in green cloth, the points of their spears dulled with ash. Even the king's crown was gone. A narrow circlet of blackened silver bound his pale hair, and his sword hung bare at his side. They passed beneath trees that had stood before the rising of the moon, roots rolling through the earth like the backs of buried beasts, crowns locked above in a roof no starlight pierced. The company moved without speech. Hooves fell upon moss, and where dead leaves lay thick, the elves dismounted and led their horses by hand. Thranduil went first. At the Ashen Brook, they found the first sign. A hare hung above the water, wrapped from ears to hind feet, its body emptied. The silk line from which it swung ran upward through 3 branches and vanished among the leaves. Thranduil bent near the bank and saw small hooked prints in the mud, hundreds together, crossing and recrossing until the earth lay raked as though by iron combs. One of the scouts, Lethuin, crouched at his shoulder and named the brood young. 2 nights from the egg, he thought. Perhaps 3. Thranduil looked at the webbed hair. And already this far north? No one answered. The brook ran thin and black between stones. On the far side, the undergrowth had been pressed flat in narrow paths, none wide enough for a wolf, yet too many for any natural swarm. Thranduil stepped across and followed them, and the others came after, leading their horses into the shadow. By midnight they had found 7 feeding places. At one, foxes lay beneath a fallen elm, each pierced and bound. At another, the upper branches of a hornbeam were hung with dead crows. The scouts cut none of them down. Thranduil marked every place upon a strip of pale bark, drawing the streams, slopes and old tree roads with the point of his knife, and the pattern widened as they went south. Near the roots of a lightning-struck oak, Lethwin found a shell split from within. It was larger than a helm, yellow along the broken edge. He lifted it with both hands, and the inner surface glistened in the torchless dark. "Not one brood," he said, and the king took the shell, turned it once, and agreed. There might be 3. "More," said Thranduil. The scout's face tightened, and he said then they had crossed the hollow ridge. "They have crossed farther than that." The king cast the shell aside. It struck a root and broke into thin, curved shards. Toward dawn, the horses began to fail them. They shivered without wind and rolled their eyes toward the branches. Thranduil ordered 2 guards to lead them back north. The rest went on afoot, bows strung, blades loose. They crossed an old hunting path, nearly lost beneath thorn and fungus, then descended into ground where even the trees had changed. Beech and oak gave way to twisted firs with bare lower limbs. The earth was soft with grey needles. Threads hung between the trunks, so fine they shone, only when breath touched them. Thranduil halted the company before the first line. "Do not cut it." A young warrior had already raised his knife. He lowered it. The king leaned close, and tiny beads trembled along the thread though the air was still. Far above, something shifted against bark. Thranduil pointed left, and 6 archers moved without sound and vanished among the firs. He pointed right, and 6 more slipped down the slope. The others remained behind him, watching the upper dark. A clicking began. It passed from tree to tree, quick and faint, like seeds shaken in dry pods, and it spread around them until the whole hollow was breathing through hidden jaws. One of the guards turned toward the rear. "Hold," said Thranduil, and the word was quiet, and every elf became still. A spider dropped behind them. It came down on a single cord, legs folding and opening, its swollen body pale as old bone. Before it touched the ground, Thranduil's arrow entered beneath one cluster of eyes and drove through the head. The creature struck the needles with a heavy thud. At once the clicking ceased. Then the wood moved. Spiders poured from the firs in silence. Not the giant brood beasts of old terror, but young things, many-legged and swift, large as hounds, their bodies striped in ash and black. They rushed low through the needles, using roots for cover. Arrows met them from both sides. The hidden archers shot downward from the slope, and the first rank of spiders tumbled over itself, legs threshing. "Circle tight," Thranduil commanded. "No flame." His guard closed around him, spears angled outward. A spider sprang from a trunk and caught an elf across the shoulder, driving him down. Thranduil crossed the space in 2 strides and cut through 2 forelegs before the fangs descended. His second stroke entered the creature's mouth and split the head to the eyes. Another rushed him from the side. He turned beneath its reaching limbs and drove his sword upward through the belly. Hot black fluid struck his sleeve. The spider folded around the blade, and he tore it free before the body fell. Across the hollow, Lethwin shouted once. Webb had caught his ankle and dragged him backward toward a root hole, and 3 spiders swarmed over the ridge above him. Thranduil seized a fallen spear and cast it. The shaft struck the foremost spider through the body and pinned it against the earth. The 2 behind it scattered, and arrows found them as they fled. The attack broke as swiftly as it had begun. Surviving spiders fled upward into the branches, vanishing along lines the elves could scarcely see. Thranduil raised his bow but did not loose. His gaze followed them south. Their retreat was ordered. They had tested the company, taken its measure, and withdrawn. 2 wounded, Galeon said behind him, neither bitten. Thranduil wiped his blade upon the dead spider's hide, and said they had been told to watch this ground. Lethuin cut the web from his boot, rose, and asked by what. The king looked toward a black wall of firs at the hollow's southern edge, beyond which the land fell away into one of the deep folds running toward Dol Guldur. A faint draught came up from below, carrying the smell of mold, old blood, and something bitter beneath both. By that which breeds them, he said. They moved on before sunrise. The slope steepened until the elves went down by roots and broken stone. Webs thickened beneath the trees. Some lay in sheets across the hollows, grey with dust and husks. Others hung in ropes from branch to branch, strong enough to bend young trunks. Thranduil counted the directions in which the lines ran and marked each upon the bark map. At the foot of the descent, they found the first nest. It lay within a grove of hollow oaks, each tree dead at the crown and living only in strips along the trunk. Web covered the grove from earth to upper bough, layer upon layer, veiling pits, branches, and narrow paths. Shapes moved behind it. Small spiders crawled over swollen egg sacs fixed to the bark, and larger ones stood motionless near the center, their legs spread across the woven floor. Thranduil watched the grove from behind a ridge of roots and said nothing, and no elf spoke either. There were too many creatures inside for a swift assault, and the webbing ran outward into the forest along 6 hidden roads. Touch fire to the edge, and half the brood would be gone before the heart of the nest so much as blackened. He pointed to each road in turn, naming them off as though counting coin, and gave Lethuin the eastern path with orders to follow it until it divided, and Galeon the north and west. Count every opening, touch nothing, return before the sun is above the firs. The scouts went. Thranduil stayed among the roots with his guard, and watched the nest wake under a dim morning. One egg sac split, and the spiderlings poured out over the bark in a pale mass, dry as spilling grain, and an older creature herded them toward a hanging carcass. Farther in, something much larger shifted beneath the webbed floor, lifting it in a slow mound before it sank again. The king's face didn't change. By the time the scouts came back, the sky above the forest had gone pale, though little enough of that light reached the ground. Galeon spread the bark map over a root and smoothed it flat with the heel of his hand. 6 roads had become 9. 2 led to smaller nests, and 1 ran south past the range of the scouts, marked along its length by the drag of a body wider than a horse. Lethuin laid a broken thorn beside the eastern line and said there were watchers in the branches, and that they had not followed him. "They saw you," said Thranduil. The scout looked up. "They allowed you to return." Nothing moved in the forest around them. Thranduil folded the bark, put it inside his coat, and said they would go north. Galeon's brow tightened at that. "Leave the nest?" And the king answered that it would be for 1 night, and turned from the grove. Behind the veils of web, the spiders went on moving among their young, certain the intruders had withdrawn. He led his company back through the dark, with the shape of the ground fixed in his mind. Before sunset, axes would be carried south. Oil would be sealed in clay, archers would take the 9 roads, and no watcher in the branches would live to carry word back to the brood. At the Ashen Brook he stopped once and looked back toward the silence behind them. "Tomorrow," he said, "we burn the first ring." Before dusk, the southern armory stood open beneath the hill. Bundles of ashwood shafts lay beside coils of rope, clay jars of oil, hooked knives, axes with narrow heads, shields covered in hide still wet enough to smell. Thranduil walked the rows while the captains took their companies in silence. He hefted one jar, set it down, and ordered half the oil struck from the train. Too much flame would make servants of the spiders and enemies of the trees. Axes forward, he said, oil behind, archers to carry 2 strings apiece. A captain named Iranian bowed and asked about torches. None until I command them lit. The chosen force went south beneath a moon veiled in cloud. 80 elves on foot, split into small companies that disappeared among the trunks and showed themselves again only when Thranduil raised his hand. The king carried no shield. His bow was dark yew and his sword narrow and bright, and beneath his cloak the mail had been rubbed over with soot. Those who walked nearest him had seen the nest and knew the 9 roads. At the Ashen Brook, the companies divided. Galion took the western roads with 20 archers. Lethwin led another band east along the slope, where the web lines ran low between the firs, and Iranian went south with axes and wet hides to close the deepest path, while Thranduil kept the center and moved toward the hollow oaks. Seal first, he told them, kill second, burn last. Nobody answered him. The command went hand to hand, through the dark instead. The Eastern Company reached its place before midnight. Lethwin found the first road, where the spiders had drawn silk across a narrow gully and braced it with fallen branches into a covered way, and his elves worked beneath it with hooked blades, cutting only the lower strands and drawing them backward through the thorn. When the web settled, they weighted it with stones. Anything fleeing down that road would run into its own roof and be pinned there. On the western paths, Galion drove sharpened stakes into the moss and bound the upper web lines down to them, and his archers went up into the oaks above and lay out along the branches with arrows already nocked. Farther south, Iranian felled 2 young firs across the deepest trail and packed their crowns with wet earth. All of it was done without a torch, without a horn, without a word spoken aloud. Thranduil watched the nest from the ridge of roots. The brood had changed since dawn. More egg sacs stood open, and pale young crawled over the woven floor, and 3 larger spiders moved among them, touching the silk with the tips of their forelegs, so that each tremor ran outward through the 9 roads. The watchers in the upper boughs turned their clustered eyes toward the forest. The king waited until every answering thread lay still, then lifted 2 fingers. Along the north road, an elf cut a single strand. The tremor ran into the grove, and one of the larger spiders went rigid, legs spread wide, testing the floor. Then it came toward the broken line, with 6 smaller creatures behind it. They crossed beneath the first dead oak and entered the narrow path, and the arrows fell without a sound. The leader rolled once and hit the earth on its back. 2 others sprang aside into the western ditch, where Galion's hidden spears came up to meet them. The rest turned for the grove, but Thranduil had already drawn. His first shaft took one through the thorax, his second cut the line above another, and dropped a curtain of web across its body. "Now," he said. Axes struck. The first blows fell on the outer deadwood, and not on the living trees, and trunks already hollowed by rot split apart under the narrow blades, so that the bound branches folded inward and dragged the web road down with them. Across the ring, other axes answered. The 9 paths shut almost together. The nest convulsed. Spiders came out of the hollow oaks in black waves, climbing over one another, tearing free of their own lines, and they struck the fallen roads and found silk and timber and stakes where there had been open ground. Archers loosed from the branches. Spears drove between roots. The first rush died against the sealed ring, and Thranduil called out to hold the mouths and not to enter. A spider bigger than the rest burst through the northern veil, striped brown and bone white, 3 arrows hanging from its hide and doing nothing to slow it. It crashed over a broken trunk and came straight at the king. Thranduil waited until its forelegs rose. His arrow entered one eye. The thing wrenched aside, struck a root, and swept 2 guards off their feet. Before it could turn, he was under it, driving his sword upward at the join behind the head. The blade hit shell and slid, and he turned the hilt, found the softer seam, and thrust again. Black blood came down over his gauntlet. The creature shuddered above him, with its legs beating at the roots, then dropped so heavily that the ground shook underfoot. "Drag it clear," he said, and 4 elves hooked ropes about the dead limbs and hauled the body aside. More spiders pressed toward the opening it had made. The king's archers were waiting for them, and the gap filled up with shafts and broken legs. Inside the grove, the brood had started cutting downward. Lethuin saw the web floor sink near the eastern oaks and called that they had holes below. Thranduil looked once and understood the shape of it. The nest did not sit upon the earth. It went into it. Axes to the inner roots. Open the ground before they do. Aranion's company went in under shields covered with wet hide, crossing the first curtain while arrows passed over their shoulders. Hooks caught the web and dragged it aside. Axes bit into dead root and packed earth, and beneath the blows the sound came back hollow. The earth broke open. Spiderlings poured from the cleft, pale and blind, clinging together in a writhing sheet that flowed over boots and shields and hunted for the gaps in mail. One elf went down on a knee and disappeared beneath them to the waist. His companions caught his cloak and hauled him back while the others crushed the creatures with shield rims and spear butts. Thranduil came forward and asked for oil. 2 jars were brought. He broke the first against the mouth of the cleft and poured the second out along the inner roots, and the smell of it spread sharp beneath the web, and the spiders shrank back from it, with their legs scraping wildly at bark and earth. Fire now. Covered lamps were opened. Small flames stood up in the hands of the rear guard, yellow and hard beneath the black trees, and no torch was lifted high. Each bearer waited on the king's mark. Thranduil pointed to the cleft. A single flame went in. The oil caught with a low breath. Fire ran beneath the roots, went into the hollow ground, and was gone. Nothing came of it, not for a heartbeat. Then red light burst upward through cracks all across the grove, and the web took light from below. Flame climbed the dead oaks in twisting lines, moving through the old silk with terrible speed, turning grey veils gold, and then black. Egg sacs burst one after another. Spiderlings dropped burning from the trunks, and the older brood rushed toward every road at once. The sealed ring held. At the western path, Galleon's archers shot until the bodies made a wall of themselves. One creature climbed over that wall, trailing fire from its back, and got as far as the lower branches, before Galleon cut its foreleg with his sword and drove it down into the stakes. On the eastern slope, the trapped roof sagged beneath fleeing spiders, until the whole gully became a woven pit full of thrashing limbs. Thranduil moved around the ring wherever the pressure rose. At the southern mouth, a black spider forced its head beneath the fallen firs and began tearing the branches apart. Aranion's spears glanced from its face. Thranduil took an axe from the nearest warrior, stepped onto the trunk, and struck through the joint of the creature's reaching leg. The limb fell. He struck again at the base of the fang and split the shell, and as the spider recoiled, he told them to brace the trees because it would return. It did. The creature hurled itself into the barrier, breaking one trunk and driving the other down through the wet earth, and 3 elves were cast down beneath it. Thranduil stood above them, drew his sword in both hands, and met the head as it came through. His blade entered beside the wounded fang and sank to the guard. The spider drove him backward across the moss, its weight bending him nearly to the ground, until 2 spears struck from either side and held the head long enough for the king to tear his sword free and cut across the cluster of eyes. The creature went still against the fallen fir. He told them to raise the line, and the wounded elves rose with it. Fire reached the crown of the central oak. A great shape moved there, hidden until the web burned away. It had crouched above the nest through the whole assault, dark and broad, legs wrapped around the upper limbs. When the flame touched it, the creature dropped and fell into the center of the ring like a black stone. The woven floor broke beneath it. Burning silk and broken branches rose in a storm, and 2 warriors vanished under the debris. The spider climbed out of the fire with its back aflame, larger than any creature yet seen, its mouth opening and closing around fangs wet with venom. Thranduil's captains shouted for the archers to loose. "Wait," said the king. The creature turned toward the widest gap, crushing burning spiderlings under its weight as it went. One leg dragged where fire had eaten through the joint. The others carried it with dreadful speed. "Wait." The spider crossed the outer floor. "Loose." 40 arrows struck together. The first rank shattered against the shell, the second entered the joints, the third found the eyes and mouth. The creature reared, towering above the ring, and Thranduil shot last. His arrow passed through the open mouth. The spider fell backward into the nest. The burning floor gave way beneath its body, and the whole center of the grove collapsed into the earth, flame roaring up out of the hollow, and the dead oaks leaned inward and came down one after another, burying the brood beneath fire and timber and stone. For a time only the crack of wood remained. Thranduil ordered water on the living roots. Wet hides were thrown over the northern trees where sparks had caught, and elves beat out small fires in the moss and cut burning web from the branches. No one left the ring until the last flame beyond the hollow had been smothered. Near dawn, the grove was a black pit. 3 elves were dead. 7 were wounded, 2 of them by venom. Thranduil stood beside them, while the healers cut the flesh around the bites and bound the wounds with bitter leaves, and he gave no word of comfort. His hand rested once upon the shoulder of each fallen warrior before their bodies were covered. Lethuin came from the southern edge, carrying a strip of fresh silk wound around his knife. "This was not made here," he said, "and it leads beyond the ridge." Thranduil looked toward the deeper wood. Through the smoke, a single web line ran south between the trunks, taut and unburned. Something had cut it during the battle. Something had fled before the ring closed. Galeon followed the king's gaze and said that one had escaped. "One was sent," Thranduil said. Far away, beyond the burned grove, a clicking answered from the dark. It came once from the south, then again from the east, and a third reply sounded behind the ridge, deeper and heavier than the rest. The forest carried the calls from nest to nest until they passed, or seemed to pass, beneath the earth itself. Thranduil turned to his captains and told them to gather the dead and carry the wounded north. "And the rest?" Aranion asked. The king wiped black blood from his sword and sheathed it. We remain." Behind him, the first nest burned down to red roots. Before him, the broods were waking. The answers came before noon. From the east rose the beating of wings, sudden and ragged, as whole flights of crows fled the lower wood. Deer broke north through fern and thorn, and ran until blood striped their flanks. Under all of it came a faint trembling, felt first through the roots, and then through the soles of the elves' boots. Thranduil stood at the rim of the burned nest, and watched the forest empty before the coming broods, and told them to form by companies, and leave the ash. The dead were already borne north. The wounded had gone with them under a guard of 12, and those who remained gathered axes, spears, and the unbroken jars of oil. Thranduil sent no runner after the retreating band. If the spiders had learned the northern road, a messenger would only lead them farther along it. He turned his force east before the first black shapes appeared among the southern branches. They crossed the ridge at speed. Smoke from the ruined nest clung beneath the canopy and flattened every scent. The ground beyond was split by old rain cuts, narrow at the top and deep enough at the bottom to swallow an elf whole, with roots crossing them like bridges. Web lines had been stretched beneath those roots during the night, hidden by mist and hanging moss. Lethwin saw the first too late. His leading foot broke through a false bed of leaves, silk tightened around his calf and dragged him sideways toward the cleft, and he caught a root with both hands as 3 hidden lines drew taut below. Thranduil seized the back of his harness and cut once across the web. The line recoiled into the hollow. A spider rushed upward after it. Its forelegs struck the bank where Lethwin had hung, and arrows drove into its face. But the creature twisted beneath the roots and tore at the earth, widening the cleft. More legs moved below, pale in the darkness. Thranduil ordered them back from the edges. The gullies had been woven. The company withdrew to firmer ground. Behind them, the false floors opened one by one, and spiders climbed up from beneath the ridge, leaner than those at the first nest, and dark enough to vanish against bark. They did not charge. They spread through the cuts, keeping low, touching the hidden lines. Iranian looked along the broken land and said they meant to hold the company there. "They mean to divide us." Thranduil pointed toward a stand of ancient beeches above the gullies, archers there, axes with him, and they would cross before the eastern brood closed. The elves moved uphill beneath covering shafts, while spiders climbed the far bank and sprang between the roots, striking at legs and bow arms before falling back. One caught a warrior by the shield and dragged him toward a cleft. His companions drove spears through its joints, but another came from beneath and seized the first spear in its fangs. Thranduil reached them as the line bent. He cut through the gripping limb, stepped onto the spider's back, and drove his sword between the plates behind its head. The creature convulsed beneath him. He tore the blade free and pointed it toward the upper slope. "Do not fight them in the cuts! Take the trees!" Axes bit into 2 dead trunks leaning across the highest gully. The wood had rotted inward, leaving hard shells around hollow cores, and under Thranduil's direction, the elves cut only the western sides. Ropes were thrown around the upper limbs and carried uphill. "Draw." The trunks groaned. Spiders surged from the hollows to stop them. Arrows struck the first rank, and the axe-bearers held their ground while the ropes tightened. One dead tree split at the cut and went over eastward, its branches sweeping through the beech stand, tearing down web lines and carrying 3 spiders into the ravine with them. The second trunk followed. It crushed the narrowest crossing and bridged the widest cleft with a mass of timber. "Across," said Thranduil. The elves passed over the fallen trees in 2 lines, and beneath them the spiders climbed, cutting at boots through gaps in the branches. Spears stabbed downward. Arrows were loosed at arm's length, so close the fletching brushed shell. Thranduil remained at the rear until the last axe-bearer had crossed. Then the southern brood arrived. They came through the smoke behind the company, broad-bodied creatures out of the burned ring, hides scarred by flame, some dragging half-burned limbs, others carrying black ash on their backs where web had fused to shell. They reached the gullies and climbed over the first brood without pause. The 2 swarms did not hinder one another. Galion called from the far bank, 1 word, the king's title, and Thranduil stood alone on the fallen trunk, with pale spiders climbing from the cleft below him, and the burned brood crowding the ridge at his back. He drew one of the remaining oil jars from his belt and broke it on the hollow wood. A guard raised a covered lamp. Thranduil took the flame, touched it to the oil, and crossed, while fire ran along the trunk behind him. The hollow core caught at once. Red light burst through cracks in the bark, and the spiders beneath the bridge dropped into the gully as burning sap and rotten wood came down on them. "Cut the ropes," he said. The elves severed the lines. The half-burned trunks rolled from the bank and collapsed into the cuts, and flames spread through the hidden web below until the gullies became narrow furnaces, filled with black bodies and smoke. Thranduil did not watch them burn. He led the companies east toward a stream called the Cold Run, where bare stones divided the northern hunting grounds from the deeper forest. In summer the water was swift and shallow. Spring rain had filled it from root to root. Alder branches bent above the current, their lower limbs wrapped in fresh silk, and no birds remained there. The first scouts reached the bank and stopped. Across the stream, hundreds of small spiders covered the stones, motionless, packed close, pale bodies trembling in the spray. And behind them, larger shapes waited among the alders. Aranion came up beside the king and asked whether this was another nest. Thranduil said it was a road. He followed the lines with his gaze. Web crossed the stream beneath the water, anchored to stones and roots. The spiderlings were not feeding. They guarded the passage while the older brood gathered in the trees. A clicking rose behind the elves. The burned brood had found another path around the gullies. "We cross here," Thranduil said. Aranion answered that the stones were held, and the king told him to clear them. Archers stepped forward and loosed into the mass. The small spiders scattered at once, pouring beneath stones and into the water, and for every creature struck, 10 vanished. The surface of the stream began to shake. "Shields low," Thranduil commanded. The first rank entered. Spiderlings erupted from the current and climbed their legs in swarms, and the wet shields came down like blades and swept them away. Spears churned the water. The elves moved 3 abreast, each step placed upon stone already cleared by the rank before. Halfway across, the submerged web tightened. It caught the leading warriors at the ankles and bound their feet together, and larger spiders dropped from the alder branches. One landed among the rear archers and drove an elf beneath the water. Another descended before Thranduil, fangs wide, the stream breaking around its legs. The king met it with his sword. His first cut took one foreleg, the second struck the mouth and turned the head aside. The spider lunged again and pushed him knee-deep into the current, and Thranduil planted one foot against a stone and drove the blade through the softer plate beneath its jaw. Black blood entered the water. The current carried it downstream in twisting ribbons, and the spiderlings broke from the stones and fled before it, and the larger creatures in the alders recoiled with their legs lifting high. Lethuin said they feared the blood. Thranduil pulled his sword free. Use it!" The dead spider was rolled into the stream, and its blood spread across the submerged web. At once the hidden brood beneath the water tore loose and scattered for the banks. The elves cut the remaining lines and advanced. Behind them, the southern spiders reached the cold run, and they did not enter. The burned brood gathered along the western bank, crowding from root to root. Some touched the blood-stained current and drew back. Others climbed the alders, seeking a crossing through the upper limbs. Thranduil reached the far side and turned. Axes. The lower alder branches were cut. Web lines snapped and fell into the water, and the spiders climbing above lost their purchase and dropped among the stones, where arrows met them. The current carried their bodies against the western bank. For a time the stream held. Then something vast moved behind the burned brood. Trees bent apart. Web tore from the high branches. A spider emerged, whose body stood higher than an elf's shoulder, and whose legs were thick as young trunks, and fire had never touched it. Its shell was deep brown, marked along the back by a pale shape, like a hand with spread fingers. The lesser creatures drew away from its path. It entered the water. Blood touched its legs and ran from them, but it did not slow. The current broke against its body, and each step crushed stone and spiderling together. Galeon raised his bow. "Eyes," Thranduil said. "All shafts." The first flight struck the creature's face. It lowered its head, and the arrows shattered against the heavy plates above the eyes. The second flight entered the softer joints of its legs. The great spider lurched and continued. "Higher ground," Thranduil ordered. "Draw it from the stream." The elves withdrew among the alders. They did not run. Companies opened a narrow road between them, leaving Thranduil visible at its end. The great spider climbed the bank with water streaming from its body and its mouth working around fangs curved like knives, and behind it the lesser broods began crossing at last, following in the shelter of its bulk. Thranduil stood with one arrow set. The pale mark on the creature's back shifted as its shell moved, and near the center, where the 5 white lines met, a seam opened and closed with each breath. "Hold," he said. The spider came beneath the first alder. "Hold." Its forelegs rose, and Thranduil loosed. The arrow struck the center of the pale mark and vanished to the feathers. The spider reared, turning its back toward the archers hidden on both sides. "Now." Every bow answered. Shafts drove into the opened seam, and the creature twisted, struck the nearest alder, and tore it from the bank. It fell among the roots with its legs hammering the earth. Thranduil crossed beneath the blows, and thrust his sword into the wound his arrow had made, and the blade reached the heart. The great spider sagged against the uprooted tree. Its weight dragged the trunk across the open road and closed it with branches and earth, and behind it the crossing brood halted in the water. "Fire the bank," Thranduil commanded. Oil was thrown upon the fallen alder, and the dry web packed around its roots. Flame climbed in a hard red wall. The stream divided it, holding the fire to the eastern side, while smoke rolled westward over the spiders in the current, and the broods turned back. Thranduil watched until the last black shape vanished among the trees. Then he ordered the companies north along the cold run, where stone and water would hide their passage. Lethuin looked once toward the slain creature and said it had been sent to break the crossing. "No," said Thranduil. "It was sent to learn whether we could kill it." Far south, beyond the smoke and the broken gullies, a deeper clicking rolled through Mirkwood. The answer came from more than one nest. By nightfall, The cold run had carried them 3 leagues north and east. Thranduil left 20 archers at the burned crossing beneath Galleon's command, with orders to loose only upon creatures that entered the water. The rest followed the stream until the banks narrowed and black stone rose on either side. And there the king turned south again, using the ravine to pass behind the broods that had gathered against him. Water covered their scent. Stone hid the sound of their going. The ravine ended beneath a ridge of leaning pines. Lethuin climbed first and came back with blood on his sleeve, saying the upper wood was webbed from crown to crown, that they had taken the pine road. Thranduil asked how many. Lethuin had seen no ground between them. The king looked toward the ridge. Then we do not take the ground. He gave the order to wrap the bows and bind the spears across the warriors' backs. One by one the elves went up through the pines and out along the upper limbs, where the boughs met above the webbed floor. Thranduil led, testing each branch before he trusted it with his weight. Below, spiders moved through veils of silk spread across the earth, their backs passing beneath the pale sheets like stones beneath ice. The pine road had carried deer once, down from the eastern hills into the deep forest. The track lay buried now under layered web and hung with the remains of everything that had tried to cross it. Antlers broke the surface here and there. A boar's black hide sagged between 2 roots, and farther south, a horse hung upside down from a branch, with its harness still buckled. A Renian shifted on the limb above it, and said the beast had come from their own road. Taken recently, Thranduil answered, and bent to study the harness. It bore the green clasp of a northern messenger. The satchel had been torn away. A spider moved beneath the horse and touched the hanging body with one foreleg. Another answered from farther down the road, and the web trembled between them, carrying the signal south. Thranduil raised his hand, and the elves froze among the branches. Something came along the upper silk a moment later, smaller than the great spiders at the stream, thin-bodied, long-legged, its narrow head held low against the line. A strip of green leather hung from one fang. Behind it came another, then 3 more, quick and soundless. "Runners," Lethuin whispered. Thranduil drew his knife. The first creature passed beneath him, and he dropped from the branch onto its back, one knee wedged between the plates, his knife going in behind the head before it could turn. The line shook under them. The others came at once. Arrows took 2 from above. The third leapt at him, tearing through the upper web with its raised forelegs, and he rolled beneath the blow and cut across the nearest joint. The creature twisted, and Iranian drove a spear down through its thorax from the branch. The last runner fled south. "Take it alive," Thranduil said. Lethuin sprang through the boughs ahead of it, crossed 3 branches, dropped onto the line, and cut the web before the creature reached him. The runner fell through its own road and struck the layered floor below, and silk closed around its legs. Underneath the ground web, the spiders surged toward it. Thranduil dropped after them. His boots hit the woven floor and sank to the ankles. The trapped runner thrashed in front of him, while dark shapes rushed beneath the silk. He tore the green leather from its fang and drove his sword through its head. "Cut a circle," he ordered. The elves came down around him with hooked knives, tearing through the upper layers, spears thrusting into every moving shape below. Web split open in long grey wounds, and spiders forced their heads through, only to meet blade and arrow. Thranduil reached the hanging horse and cut down the messenger's satchel. Inside lay a broken map, a seal of the woodland realm, and a strip of bark bearing 3 hurried marks. One showed the cold run, one showed the burned nest, the third pointed east toward a place called The stone mere, an old basin where rainwater gathered among black rocks. Iranian looked over his shoulder and said the messenger had found another brood. The runners took his report, Thranduil said, and Iranian finished it for him, and carried it south. The king folded the bark. They know what he knew. The ground web heaved. A broad shape rose beneath it, lifting silk and carcasses and fallen branches all together, and the elves stepped back as black legs tore through the surface. A spider came out with the dead horse caught across its shoulders, using the body as armor. Arrows struck hide and bone. The creature rushed beneath the carcass, hidden from the archers above, smashed through the cut circle, and drove 2 warriors into the pines. Thranduil waited until it had passed him, then severed the web holding the horse to its back. The carcass rolled aside. "Shoot!" Shafts entered the exposed body. The spider reared, and Thranduil struck through the joint where the foremost leg met the shell. It collapsed on that side, and Iranian's spear entered the eye. Below them, the whole pine road began to move. Spiders poured from slits in the ground web, too many to count, climbing over carcasses and over one another. The elves formed around the nearest trunks, but every step tangled their boots deeper in silk. "Up!" Thranduil commanded. "Leave the floor." They climbed under pressure, and the spiders seized cloaks, spear shafts, hanging legs. One warrior was dragged from a branch and vanished into the mass below. Thranduil caught his wrist, braced a foot against the trunk, and pulled while Lethwin hacked through the limbs clinging to him. The warrior came free with blood running from his thigh. Could he climb? Thranduil asked. Yes. Then climb. The pine road filled beneath them. Thranduil looked south toward the stone mere, where the branches dipped lower under thick web, and beyond them a dark hollow opened between the rocks. The runners had not been carrying the message toward Dol Guldur. They had been carrying it there. "Move by the crowns," he said. "The mere before dawn." The company crossed above the brood, while spiders followed them along the trunks. Arrows went down only when a creature climbed high enough to threaten the line. Several times the elves cut branches behind them, dropping spiders and web together into the road. Near midnight the pines ended. The stone mere lay below, a wide basin ringed by black ridges and filled with dark water. No stream entered it. Rain gathered there and stayed beneath the trees, cold even in summer, and the surface was hidden under a skin of web so broad and so still that fallen leaves rested on it. An island of stone rose at the center, and the spiders covered it. Some were small and pale, others were broad as carts, their bodies marked with white bands. Along the shore stood larger brood guards with scarred shells and broken limbs, creatures that had survived earlier fires and come back. Between them lay bundles wrapped in green cloth. Elves. Thranduil went down before the others could speak. He moved along the eastern ridge until the wind came toward him off the basin. The air smelled of standing water and venom, and beneath that lay the sharper scent of fresh blood. He asked how many prisoners. Lethwin counted the bundles and said 9. Living? 1 moved. Iranion studied the web-covered water and said the whole mere was a trap, and Thranduil said yes. The king drew out the strip of bark and looked again at the messenger's final mark. 3 short cuts stood beside the basin, almost hidden beneath blood. Not nests, openings. He turned toward the ridges. The black stone around the mere was pierced by low caves, and web ran from each mouth into the water, then onward to the island. The spiders had gathered several broods in one place, and tied them together across the basin. "They are not waiting for us," Thranduil said. "They are feeding before they march." A low clicking rose from the island. The brood guards lifted their heads. One struck the webbed surface with its forelegs, and the signal passed through the mere. From every cave came an answering tremor. Thranduil looked at the 9 bound elves. "Archers to the eastern ridge," he said. "Axes to cut the pines above the northern caves. Oil to the western shore." Aranion frowned at the black water and asked about the island. "I take it," said the king. "With how many?" 12. The captain's jaw tightened, but he bowed. Before the companies separated, Thranduil caught Lethwin by the arm and put the messenger's bark map into his hand. "If the island broke beneath them," he said, "close every cave. With fire? With stone?" The king turned down the ridge. No moon touched the mere. The web covering it shone faintly under the trees, stretched from shore to island in a single unbroken field. Thranduil stepped onto it and felt the water move beneath his boots. 12 elves followed behind him. Across the basin, the largest brood guard lowered its head and began to advance. The web sank beneath Thranduil's first step and held. Cold water pressed up through the grey weave, making the whole surface breathe under his boots. The 12 came on in a single line, each placing his feet where the one before had passed, and beneath them, dark shapes moved through the mere. The king watched the island and did not look down. The largest brood guard came over the web with its legs spread wide, its body low and black, the head scarred across by old blades. 2 lesser spiders advanced on either side, testing the woven surface before each step. Behind them, the bound elves lay near the island's edge, wrapped to the throat. 3 shafts, Thranduil said. The left eye. Bows rose behind him. The arrows struck together. 2 shattered against the heavy shell, but the 3rd found the place where the scar had pulled one plate crooked over the eye, and the brood guard lurched so hard that the web beneath it dipped deep into the mere. The lesser spiders sprang forward. Thranduil dropped to one knee as the first passed above him, its forelegs sweeping empty air where his head had been. He cut upward through the joint. The creature fell across the narrow line of elves, and a spear entered its mouth from behind and drove it sideways into the water. The second spider struck the web with both forelegs, and the surface split. 3 elves fell waist-deep as water burst through the torn silk. Shapes rushed toward them from below, pale bellies turning beneath the black surface. Thranduil seized the nearest warrior by the collar and hauled him onto the unbroken weave, telling him not to struggle. "Cut downward!" Knives stabbed into the water. A spiderling rose against a warrior's chest and took a blade through the head. Another fastened upon a boot and was crushed beneath the rim of a shield. The brood guard came on with the arrow still buried in its eye. It struck the leading elf aside and drove toward Thranduil, and the king gave ground one measured step at a time, drawing it farther from the island. The web bowed under its weight. Water climbed around its legs. "Now," he said. The rear archers loosed into the woven floor behind the creature. Broad-headed arrows cut the supporting strands, and the web tore in a widening arc. The brood guard twisted as one side of the surface gave way, but its legs caught the remaining lines and held. Thranduil ran toward it. He stepped upon one raised limb, climbed the scarred shell, and drove his sword into the wounded eye. The creature reared so sharply that he was lifted above the water. One foreleg swept backward, seeking him. He tore the blade sideways through the inner plate and leapt clear. The brood guard fell through the broken web. Its body struck the mere with a great black splash, and for a moment its legs beat above the surface. Then the shapes below gathered upon it, white and grey beneath the water, and dragged it down. "Forward," said Thranduil. The island erupted. Spiders poured from the far side of the stone, climbing over one another in their haste to reach the prisoners. Some seized the bound elves and began dragging them toward the cave lines. Others rushed onto the web, spreading wide to surround the king's company. From the eastern ridge, arrows began to fall. Iranian's archers shot in ordered flights, each volley driving the spiders away from the captives. On the northern rim, axes struck the leaning pines, and the blows rolled across the mere like slow thunder. Thranduil reached the island first. The web was fixed to iron hooks driven into cracks in the stone, and he cut 2 lines as he climbed, loosening the eastern edge. 3 brood guards met him among the rocks. The first came high, fangs spread. Thranduil stepped inside the reach and drove his sword beneath the jaw. The second caught his cloak and tore it from his shoulders. He turned with the pull, cut the gripping limb, and used the falling body of the first creature as a shield against the third. His elves came behind him. Spears drove between the rocks. Swords flashed close to the ground, where the spider's legs crowded together. No battle cry rose. Only the scrape of shell, the strike of iron, and the king's commands crossed the island. "Cut the prisoners free." All 4 warriors broke from the line and reached the nearest bundles, and hooked knives opened the web at throat and wrist. The first captive drew breath and coughed black water from his mouth. Thranduil asked, without turning, whether he could stand, and the elf said that he could, "My king," and was told to take a blade. He rose unsteadily and seized a fallen spear. Another bundle moved near the western edge, a broad spider standing over it, feeding. Thranduil crossed the stone before the creature sensed him. His sword split 1 fang and entered the mouth behind it. The spider recoiled, pulling the prisoner with it. Thranduil caught the webbing around the elf's chest and held fast, and for a moment man and beast drew against one another, across the black rock. Then Iranian's arrow descended from the ridge and struck the spider between the eyes. The prisoner came free. 7 living, Lethwin called from the eastern side. 2 are cold. Take the living first. The northern pines began to fall. 1 tree came down across the first cave mouth, crushing the web road beneath its trunk. A second struck the ridge and rolled into the basin. Spiders streamed from the caves ahead of it, filling the shore. Thranduil saw the movement and raised his sword. Western oil. Clay jars shattered along the far bank. Flame sprang low among the stones and ran outward through the dry silk. The western cave lines caught first, and fire crossed the web toward the island in red, branching paths. The spiders answered with a sound like stones ground beneath the earth. Every creature in the basin turned toward the flame. Some rushed to cut the burning lines, others fled into the water, and the brood on the island tightened around Thranduil's company. A white-banded spider climbed from a cleft at the island's center. It was larger than the scarred guard, its swollen body streaked with silver, its legs ringed in pale hair. Beneath it crawled dozens of young, clinging to the lower shell and dropping upon the stone as it moved. Lethwin stared once and named it Brood Mother. "Lesser," said Thranduil. The creature struck its forelegs against the stone, and the spiderlings rushed ahead in a pale flood. "Shields down!" The elves locked their shields edge to edge. The first wave broke against them, climbing over leather and wood, forcing narrow legs through every gap. Swords rose and fell behind the wall. The freed captives fought among their rescuers, weak in limb and hard in hand. The lesser brood mother advanced through its own young. Arrows struck its swollen body and sank without slowing it. One eye burst beneath a shaft. The creature climbed onto the shield wall, driving 3 elves to their knees beneath its weight. Thranduil stepped onto the fallen shields. He cut one leg at the first joint, then another. The brood mother twisted, and its abdomen swept him from his feet. He struck the rock hard enough to lose his sword. The creature turned upon him. Its fangs opened, and venom fell in heavy drops and smoked where it touched the stone. Thranduil rolled beneath the first strike and seized a broken spear. The second blow split the rock beside his head. He drove the spear upward into the softer mouth and braced the butt against the ground, and the broodmother's own weight forced the iron deeper. Its jaws closed around the shaft and broke it. Thranduil rose inside the reach of the fangs. His sword lay 3 paces away. He drew his long knife and plunged it through the wounded eye, and the creature convulsed, lifting him from the stone with one sweeping leg. 2 guards seized him before he fell into the mere. The broodmother staggered toward the island's edge, spiderlings spilling from its body. Thranduil tore free of his guards, recovered his sword, and cut through the rear joint as the creature turned. It fell sideways into the fire. Flame caught the pale hairs first. The broodmother thrashed upon the western web, spreading fire across its own body and through the young that clung to it. And the burning mass tore the remaining lines from the island. The webbed surface began to collapse. "Prisoners to the eastern bank," Thranduil commanded. "All companies withdraw by the stone line." The elves lifted those who could not walk and moved across the narrow strip of web still held by the eastern hooks. Beneath them, water opened in long black channels, and spiders swam there, striking upward with their forelegs. Thranduil remained on the island until the last captive had crossed. Lethwin stood beside him and said that the caves were closing. Across the basin, fallen pines and burning web had sealed 3 mouths. From the others came a steady stream of fleeing spiders, all moving south through cracks in the ridge. "Then this was never their gathering place," Thranduil said. A section of stone split near the dead broodmother. Beneath it lay a shaft descending into darkness, the inner walls wrapped in old silk, thick with cast shells and bones. Fresh lines ran downward, taut from the weight of many creatures moving below. The island was only a roof. Thranduil looked into the shaft while fire spread around him. Far beneath the mere, the clicking rolled away through the earth, carrying warning from brood to brood. Lethwin asked how far. The king cut one of the descending lines and watched it recoil into the dark. "Far enough to reach the great nest." The last eastern hook tore free. Thranduil and Lethwin crossed as the island's web collapsed behind them, stone and flame and dead spiders falling together into the black water, and the mere closed over the lot of it in a storm of steam. On the eastern ridge, the rescued elves lay beneath the trees, Aranian having formed the companies around them. Beyond the basin, the surviving broods fled south through the pines in ordered streams. Thranduil came among his warriors with water running from his mail and black blood drying on his hands, and gave his orders without stopping. The wounded north, every shaft beneath the mere marked, and none of them followed. Aranian looked toward the retreating spiders and said that they were escaping. "They are returning." To the great nest, then. Thranduil took the blood-marked map from Lethwin and drew a dark line south from the stone mere. The trail did not remain underground. At dawn, the fleeing broods rose through root holes south of the basin and crossed the forest in long, ordered bands, moving beneath bracken, along dry stream beds, over the lower limbs where the wood grew close. Thranduil followed with 46 unwounded warriors and left the rescued elves and the worst of the bitten under Aranion's guard. No horn marked their going. The spiders themselves showed the road. Rain began before midday. It fell cold through the leaves and turned ash to black paste on the elves' boots, and behind them, the last flame at the mere went out. Ahead, the web lines shone through the downpour, each strand thick enough to carry the trembling of the retreating host. Thranduil ordered every bowstring covered and every cloak cast back from the sword arm. Lethuin moved near him and said that fire would not take in this. It would take where they gave it shelter. The broods knew the rain, Lethuin said, and the king answered that they had chosen the hour. He stooped beside a web stretched low through the fern. Water ran along it without breaking the line. Dark resin worked into the silk, heavy, slow to burn. He touched the strand with the edge of his knife, and the whole trail answered far ahead. The spiders stopped moving. Thranduil rose. They know we follow. The first shaft came from the trees. It was no arrow but a sharpened length of bone flung from a hidden web, and it struck an elf beneath the collar and drove him backward into the ferns. 3 more followed from different heights, each cast by the release of tightened silk. One glanced from Thranduil's mail, another buried itself in a root beside his foot. He called for cover above and blades outward, and the elves raised shields and moved beneath the nearest beeches, while more bone hissed through the rain, the spiders unseen among the branches, pulling and loosing the hidden cords from beyond bowshot. Lethuin cut one shaft from the wounded warrior's shoulder and said they had learned the cast. They had learned from hunters. Thranduil followed the angle of the next bone as it struck. The cord that had thrown it ran between 2 high branches, then down behind a wall of ivy. He pointed with his sword and sent 6 to the western trunk to cut the lower anchors. They moved under shields. Bone struck wood above their heads. One warrior reached the ivy and found 3 resin-dark lines fixed around a root, and his axe fell once. The hidden engine tore itself apart. A branch sprang upward and dragged a spider out of concealment, and the creature swung into open air with 2 cords wound about its forelegs, and arrows took it before it could climb. Along the slope, the others began cutting their own lines and withdrawing south. "Forward," said Thranduil. They climbed through the rain while the traps broke ahead of them, and each height showed another prepared road. Web pits under fallen leaves, dead limbs bound above the path and weighted with stones, bone hooks hung at throat level between the trunks and almost invisible in that grey light. Thranduil read the ground before every step. Where moss lay too smooth, he sent spears ahead. Where leaves rested against the wind, he had them swept aside. Twice they found pits filled with web and sharpened antler. Once they uncovered the body of a woodman laid upright beneath the path, his hands fixed around a cord meant to close upon whoever tried to free him. The king cut the dead man down himself. Galion said to burn him when the rain passed, and Thranduil looked away south along the trail and said they would carry him north when the ground was theirs. They moved on. Near evening, the land rose into a region of red pines called the Spearwood, where the trunks stood tall and narrow over bare earth. Lightning had scarred many of them in years long past, and their dead upper limbs crossed like black lances beneath the clouds. The broods entered there and vanished. No web marked the ground. Thranduil halted at the first pine. Rain struck the needles above, but none of it reached the earth within. The air beneath the trees was warm and close, and resin scented the darkness. Lethwin crouched, touched the soil, said that nothing had crossed. Everything has crossed. Thranduil looked upward. Spiders lay flat along the undersides of the limbs, bodies hidden behind the bark-colored plates of their backs. Hundreds had come into the spearwood without once touching the ground, legs gripping branch after branch in complete silence. The first dropped behind the elven line. Thranduil turned before it landed, and his sword opened the creature from mouth to lower shell, and as it fell, the trees released the rest. Spiders came down on every side. They struck shields, backs, shoulders, the bare earth between the companies. Some descended on cords, others leapt trunk to trunk, using the high limbs to change direction above the archers. The elves formed tight circles beneath the pines, and the creatures fell inside the rings. "Break into fours," Thranduil commanded. "No close wall." The companies opened at once, each four facing outward around one archer, room enough for blades to move. Spiders rushed the new gaps and found crossing spears waiting for them. Thranduil fought between the groups, directing each turn. Left crown, 3 above, arrows rose, 2 spiders fell, and the third dropped its cord and came in behind Galion. But the king caught the line around his gauntlet and pulled, and the creature swung wide, struck a trunk, and was pinned there by a spear. Ground beneath the red root, an elf drove his blade into the soil, and a hidden spider burst upward out of a narrow burrow, with earth streaming from its back, and Thranduil cut its forelegs while it climbed, and stamped the head beneath his boot. The broods pressed harder. These were no young nestlings. Their bodies were lean, their limbs long, their movements exact, and they attacked in turns, one band descending while another climbed to fresh branches. When the elves loosed upward, spiders rushed across the ground. When swords came low, bone shafts fell from the heights. Galion took a fang across his shield and lost it from his hand, and the spider drove him back against a trunk. Before its mouth reached him, Thranduil cut through the rear legs on one side and rolled the creature into the path of another, telling him to stay upright. "I had not chosen otherwise," said Galion, taking up his sword. A great cracking passed through the spearwood. The upper limbs had begun to bend. Web lines tightened between the crowns, pulling the old trees inward from every side. The spiders were drawing the pines together over the elven companies, and dead branches tore loose and fell like spears. "Clear the center," Thranduil called. "Axes to the eastern trunks." The elves moved while wood crashed around them. One branch struck a warrior across the back and put him into the earth. Another split a spider as it landed. The whole grove groaned beneath the strain. Thranduil reached the largest pine and saw the web bound around it in braided ropes, the rain having swollen the silk until it held like cable. 3 axe blows scarcely marked it. He called for oil beneath the braid, and a clay jar was broken against the trunk, so that the oil ran under the web and gathered in the rough bark. And an elf opened a covered coal, shielding it from the rain beneath his cloak. The flame caught small and blue. It climbed the oil without touching the wet outer silk. Resin began to boil in the wounded pine, and fire entered the bark. "Stand clear!" The trunk split from within. A red line opened upward through the wood, the bound web snapped, and the neighboring pines, released from the pull, sprang apart and tore dozens of spiders from the branches. The whole eastern crown came down in a storm of limbs. Thranduil pointed to the fallen wood. "Take the ridge through the breach." The elves drove forward beneath the burning pine. Spiders rushed to close the opening, but fire had begun moving through the resin-rich branches in spite of the rain, running along the dead upper limbs in bright channels, leaping from one broken crown to the next. The spearwood burned above and stayed dark below. Flaming spiders dropped through the wet air. Some hit the earth and died there. Others came on regardless, fire running loose over their backs, and the elves met them with shields and thrusting spears and forced them beneath the falling branches. Thranduil reached the southern ridge first. Beyond it lay a wide stretch of forest, stripped of undergrowth. The trees girdled with web and bled of sap, their bark hanging pale and loose. Across the open ground stood pillars of woven silk, each taller than an elf, each packed with old bones. The fleeing broods crossed between them. At the far end, the earth rose into a black hill beneath the trees. No stone showed through its covering. Web lay over it in layer upon layer, running from the ground to the highest branches, and openings pierced its lower face, broad enough for several great spiders to pass abreast. Every line from every conquered nest ran into that hill. Lethwin came up at Thranduil's side, breathing hard, and said it was the great nest. No. The scout looked at him. Thranduil went on, watching the broods disappear into the openings. Above the black hill, higher among the trees, shapes moved behind veils too vast to measure, and the ground under the elves' feet trembled in slow, deep pulses. This is its outer hold. Behind them, the spearwood fire reached the western crown. Rain could not master it now. Red light filled the high branches and threw long shadows over the stripped ground, and the mouths in the black hill opened wider. Armored spiders came out in ranks, shells ridged and heavy, forelegs plated with hardened web and bark. Between them moved smaller creatures carrying strands hooked to bone frames. Farther back, something beat against the inner walls with a weight that shook dust from the trees. Thranduil counted the openings. 7 low mouths, 2 above, 1 concealed behind a hanging curtain to the east. Gelion said they would take none of it tonight, and when the king turned to him, he lowered his gaze and gave his reasons. The warriors spent, the rain hiding their number. No ring around them. All true. Then we fall back to the spearwood. We fall back 1 ridge. Thranduil looked out over the stripped ground and fixed each pillar, each hollow, each dead tree in memory. The spiders had chosen a fortress in front of the great nest. They expected pursuit to break on it. He raised his sword toward the burning pines and told them to cut fire from the crowns, carry it in bark, fell the northern trees across the open ground. Lethwin saw the shape of the command and asked if it was a wall. A gate. Behind the black hill, the deeper pulsing quickened. Thranduil watched the armored brood advance into the rain. At dawn, he said, we drive them through it. The elves worked through the rain beneath the burning crowns. They cut long strips of resinous bark from the fallen pines and folded live embers inside them, binding each bundle in wet hide. Axes opened the northern trees at their roots. Ropes were fixed high around the trunks and drawn toward the stripped ground. Thranduil moved from company to company, shifting each line by a pace, lowering one cut, raising another, shaping the fall before the first tree so much as groaned. Leave the eastern gap, he told them, narrow enough for 3 abreast. Gelion looked toward the black hill, where armored spiders waited before its mouths, still under the rain, and said they would see the road. They must. The first tree fell before dawn. It struck the stripped ground with a blow that shook bones loose from the web pillars. A second came down across it, then a third, their branches woven together by ropes and hooked limbs. The elves dragged dead brush beneath the trunks and packed resin bark along the northern side, and slowly a wall took shape across the open ground, broken only by the eastern gate Thranduil had left. The spiders did not attack. They gathered in deeper ranks before the black hill, rain running over their plated shells and dripping from the hardened web bound around their forelegs. Smaller creatures moved among them, fixing bone frames to the ground, each frame holding a braided strand drawn back like a bowstring. Lethwin crouched behind the fallen wall and named them, more casting engines. Thranduil watched the angle of the frames and said they meant to break the wall before they crossed it. "And if we light it first?" the scout asked. "They remain in their hold." The king turned toward the eastern gate. Beyond it lay a narrow passage between two web pillars, then a shallow depression filled with blackened leaves, and from there the ground rose towards the hill. 20 archers, he said, hidden low, no shaft until the third rank enters. Iranian, back from the mare with those still fit to fight, bowed and took the eastern company away. The wounded had gone north. Those left bore fresh bandages under their mail and moved without complaint. By first light the rain thinned. Mist rose off the stripped ground. The fire in the spearwood had sunk into red seams along the fallen trunks, hidden under steam and char, and Thranduil ordered every ember covered until the wall lay dark and wet before the spiders. Then the bone engines loosed. Sharpened shafts crossed the open ground in a low storm, striking the fallen trees, splitting against stone, burying themselves among the branches. Several carried hooked cords that tightened the instant they struck, and the spiders behind the frames began to pull. The wall shifted. One trunk rolled half a turn, another lifted at the crown. Web lines drew taut through the mist, dragging at the barrier. "Cut only the left cords," Thranduil said. Elves went out under cover of the wall and severed the western lines. The eastern cords they left alone. As the spiders hauled, the trunks turned toward the gate and narrowed the opening exactly as the king intended. Gelion saw it and nodded once. They were drawing the door upon themselves. The spiders pulled harder. A branch tore free. One of the great trunks slid across the mud and opened a dark road through the center, and at once the armored brood moved. They came in close ranks, forelegs raised behind plates of bark and hardened silk, bone shafts resting along their backs. Smaller spiders ran beneath them, hidden by the greater bodies. The first line crossed the stripped ground without haste. Thranduil waited behind the wall and told Lethwin to count them. 20 in the first, the scout said, watching through a gap in the branches. 20 behind, more still leaving the mouths. Let them come. The first rank reached the broken wall and started climbing, plated limbs catching the branches and pulling them apart. The second rank pressed close behind, bone frames carried forward between them. Still, Thranduil gave no command. One spider found the eastern gate and turned into it. 3 followed, then 10. The narrow road filled with black bodies moving 3 abreast toward Iranian's hidden archers, and the third rank entered the open ground. "Fire!" said Thranduil. Wet hides were torn from the ember bundles. Flame rose along the wall in a single hard line, resin catching beneath the rain-soaked bark, red tongues driving through the branches. The spiders climbing over were struck from below, hardened web blackening, splitting, curling around their limbs. At the eastern gate, Iranian's archers stood. Their first flight entered the eyes and mouths of the leading rank. The second struck the joints of those behind. The passage filled with fallen spiders, and the creatures at the rear came on anyway and climbed over them. "Close the gate," Thranduil called. Ropes were cut from the northern trunks. The outermost tree rolled downhill and crashed across the opening, its burning crown sweeping through the passage, crushing spiders, sealing the road behind those already inside. The brood in the eastern hollow was caught between the archers and the wall of fire. The black hill answered. A deep blow sounded from within, then another, and the upper mouths opened and let long-legged spiders down on cords behind the elven line. Thranduil had expected them. Rear spears. The reserve companies turned before the first creature touched earth. Spears rose in crossed ranks, and the spiders struck the points and folded on them. Others swung wide and tried for the archers, and the elves cut their cords and brought them down into the burning brush. One great spider landed beyond the spear wall and rushed Thranduil from behind. Galleon shouted. The king turned under the sweeping foreleg, seized the hardened web plate bound to it, and used the creature's own weight to drag the limb across the next. The spider stumbled. Thranduil cut through the inner joint, stepped beneath the lowered head, and drove his blade upward behind the fangs. "Keep the front," he said as it fell. "The rear is held." The armored brood struck the burning wall. Some climbed through flame, using the bodies of those before them as cover. Others hammered the trunks with plated legs until bark and embers burst outward, and the smaller ones came low, crawling beneath the logs through the mud, seeking ankles in the smoke. Thranduil moved to the center and gave the order for hooks low. Plates torn away, and the elves caught the hardened coverings with iron and pulled until bark shields ripped from spider limbs, and the joints beneath opened to arrows and swords. One creature forced half its body through the wall and seized an elf around the waist. Thranduil cut the gripping foreleg, then the second, and the warrior fell backward alive. The spider's head came after him. He drove both hands against his sword and struck through the eye cluster. The blade entered deep. Still the creature pushed forward, and two guards joined him, bracing spear shafts against the mouth, and together they held until the fire reached the soft plates beneath the shell. It collapsed into the wall. Its body opened a breach, and armored creatures poured through. "Yield 3 paces," Thranduil commanded. The elven line withdrew in order, drawing the brood beyond the shelter of the burning trunks, and the spiders surged after them, believing the center broken. Thranduil raised his sword. Archers hidden on both flanks loosed across the breach, shafts coming from opposing sides to strike the spiders where their plates did not cover them. Forelegs failed. Bodies turned sideways. The narrow ground behind the wall became choked with wounded creatures. At his word, the elves returned with spear and blade and struck the stalled brood before it could reform. Spears entered mouths, axes broke joints, swords worked beneath shell where arrows had opened the seams, and Thranduil led through the center, his pale hair dark with rain, his blade black to the hilt. The armored rank broke. Some tried to return through the burning wall. Others fled east toward the sealed gate, and those trapped there found Aranion's company descending from the ridge with axes. No spider reached the hill. For a moment, the stripped ground stood clear between the elves and the outer hold. Fire burned behind them. Dead brood covered the mud before them. Then the black hill opened. Its lower face split along 7 hidden seams, and curtains of web drew upward, and more mouths appeared beneath those already seen, deep and broad, their walls lined with bone. From them came the wardens of the outer hold. They were fewer than the broods before them, and greater than any spider slain at the mere. Their shells were ridged like old stone. Bone armor covered their heads and lower bodies, fixed with black cords through the living plates, and each of them carried scars from ancient wounds. The foremost bore antlers bound across its crown. Thranduil looked once at the harness pieces hanging from the armor. Green clasps, elven mail, broken blades taken from the dead. Galion drew breath through his teeth and said they had armed themselves with the fallen. Then we take it back. The antlered warden struck the ground, and the wardens advanced apart from one another, leaving space for their limbs and weight. Behind them, the smaller spiders remained within the mouths, guarding the dark. Thranduil ordered the companies into 3 wedges. "Do not meet the heads," he told them. "Open the sides. Let them enter." The wardens crossed the stripped ground. Bone shafts broke against their armor, and arrows entered the seams, but did not turn them. The antlered creature came straight toward Thranduil, carrying half a green shield across its breast. The elven wedges opened, the wardens entered the gaps, and at once the companies closed upon their flanks. Axes struck the rear joints. Hooks seized the bone plates and pulled. The creatures turned with crushing force, sweeping warriors from their feet. The antlered warden lowered its head and charged the king. Thranduil stood before it until the last instant, then stepped aside and cut the cord holding the stolen shield. The plate fell. Beneath it, an old spear point remained buried in the creature's breast, half swallowed by scar tissue. And he struck that point with the pommel of his sword and drove the broken spear inward. The warden reared. Thranduil caught one antler, climbed beneath the raised head, and pulled himself onto the armored crown, while the creature spun and struck at him with its forelegs. He cut the cords around the bone plates. Armor fell away piece by piece, and arrows from Galion's line struck the newly opened shell until the warden crashed against a web pillar and shattered it, filling the air with old bones. Thranduil remained upon its back. He found the seam behind the head and drove his sword through it with both hands, and the blade sank to the guard. The creature staggered 3 steps and fell before the central mouth. Across the field, the other wardens were dying. One tore through Iranion's wedge before axes severed both rear legs. Another reached the burning wall and was trapped between flame and spears. A third climbed a dead tree, only to bring the weakened trunk down upon itself. The last turned toward the hill, and Thranduil pulled his sword from the antlered warden and pointed. "Take it before the gate." Lethuin's archers loosed at the rear joints, and the creature faltered. Galion's spears struck from the right. Iranion's axes opened the left side. The warden fell within sight of the dark mouths it had guarded, and the spiders inside withdrew. Thranduil did not allow the elves to follow. He walked to the central opening and stood beneath the hanging web, where warm air came from within, heavy with venom and decay. The passage descended sharply, then divided beyond the reach of sight. Lethuin came beside him and said they were abandoning the hold, and Thranduil answered that they were emptying it, and Lethuin named the great nest. Thranduil looked at the many tracks leading inward. Every surviving brood had passed that way. The outer fortress had spent its wardens to gain time. Behind them, the wall of fire began to sink. The king turned to the companies. 11 elves lay dead upon the stripped ground, and more stood wounded, some unable to raise a bow. The rain had ceased. Steam moved among the fallen spiders. "Strip every plate that will bear flame," he ordered. "Take the bone armor for shields. Fill the mouths with smoke." Galion glanced into the hold and asked whether they would not enter. and Thranduil said they would make them leave by the southern shafts. "And follow above," Galeon said. Thranduil took the antler crown from the dead warden and cast it into the fire. "We close the ring before they reach home." Smoke entered the outer hold before sunrise. Thranduil ordered green boughs heaped over the eastern mouths and resin packed beneath them. Fire set low, then covered with wet hides until thick black vapor crawled into the passages. The elves sealed the upper openings with felled limbs and stone. Only the southern shafts were left clear. At first, nothing moved. Then the hill began to cough. Spiders came from the southern ground in broken streams, blinded by smoke, their forelegs beating the earth before them. Archers waited among the stripped trees, and each creature was allowed to clear the shaft before the arrows fell, so the bodies would not block those behind. "Keep the mouths open," Thranduil said. "Empty it fully." The smoke thickened. Young brood fled first, pale and swift, hunters after them with resin-dark hides, and behind those came wounded wardens dragging ruined limbs, then egg-bearers with swollen sacks bound beneath their bodies. The elves shot the bearers last, after they had carried their burdens into the open ground. One sack split beneath an arrow. Spiderlings spilled across the mud in a white flood, and spears and shield rims crushed them before they reached the roots. Thranduil passed through the line with his sword drawn, marking each southern trail taken by the survivors. "They divide," Galeon said, and the king answered that they would join again. 3 paths led from the hold. One crossed a dead birchwood. One descended toward a chain of marshy hollows. The last climbed beneath a ridge where ancient roots had broken through the stone. Thranduil divided his companies. Aranion took the birchwood with 12 archers and orders to drive the brood south without closing upon it. Galeon took the marsh path and carried the remaining jars of oil. Thranduil chose the ridge with Lethuin and the strongest spear-bearers. "No horn unless the ring failed," he told them, and at sunset they were to close inward. The king's band climbed under a dim red sky. The ridge narrowed between slabs of black stone. Web had been fixed beneath the overhangs, hidden from above and protected from rain, and spiders moved through those covered ways, always southward, carrying strips of meat and cast shells toward the unseen nest. Thranduil followed close enough to hear their limbs strike stone. The first hazard waited where the ridge split. A narrow bridge of root crossed a cleft filled with thorn and web, and the fleeing brood passed over it one by one. As the elves approached, spiders hidden below cut the supporting fibers. The root sagged. 2 warriors dropped to their knees, and a third slipped clean off the edge and caught the web hanging beneath, where hooked limbs came out of the dark and closed on him. Thranduil went flat on his belly and got a hand round the warrior's wrist. "Cut beneath you." The hanging elf worked his knife free and stabbed blindly downward. Something shrieked under him. Its grip loosened for the space of 1 breath, long enough for the king to haul him up over the lip, while the others drove spears down into the cleft. Behind them, the bridge tore loose. Thranduil looked across the gap. The spiders had stopped on the far slope and simply waited there among the stones, holding the only passage, and he called for ropes. Hooks went over the upper roots. 3 elves crossed hand over hand, with archers shooting into the rocks above them, and once they were across they fixed the lines low and drew them taut, so the rest could go over beneath the brood's line of sight. It worked until the last of them reached the slope. Then the spiders came out of cover, and they went for the ropes first, trying to cut the road away behind the crossing. Thranduil held the narrow ground with 5 spears and told them to thrust at the second joints and let the heads pass. The foremost spider climbed the spear points and pinned itself between the shafts. He took both forelegs off and put his sword through the side of its head, and the carcass blocked the path long enough for the rear company to come over. More came across the top of it. The elves gave ground a step at a time, drawing the brood away from the cleft, and when the last rope was cut free, Thranduil raised his hand. "Turn!" The spear line went forward. Between stone walls, the spiders had no room to spread their limbs. Blades found joints and the soft seams beneath, bodies stacked against the rock on either side, and what survived abandoned the ridge and went down a root hole under the southern stones. Lethwin knelt by the opening and said they had another road below. They had many, the king answered, and ordered the hole sealed with stone, and they moved on. At midday they reached the dead birchwood, white trunks, bare, each one wrapped at the base in web. Iranian's company was working along the western edge, driving a brood southward with firebrands carried under bark, and the spiders would not stand and fight. They ran tree to tree, cutting the web behind them so that whole birches came down across the elven path. One struck the ground in front of Thranduil's band and burst apart, and the hollow core of it was packed with spiderlings. They came through the broken bark and went up the nearest warriors, and the line scattered under them. Thranduil took a fallen branch, pushed it into a resin flame, and swept the burning end low along the ground until the pale things curled and blackened. "Circle the flame," he called, "feet inward." The elves formed round the firebrand with the brood pressing from every side. More birches came down. Every broken trunk let out another swarm, and he saw the shape of it then, and said the wood was the nest. Iranian came through the smoke to him, asking whether he meant every hollow trunk. "Enough of them," the king said, and looked south, where the adults were pulling back out of the birches and leaving the young behind to hold the ground. He wanted a lane cut eastward, not the whole wood burned. A lane. Axes opened the white trunks on one side only, and the elves felled them inward toward the center, crushing webs and closing the brood inside. Fire was laid along the cut lane, a narrow red wall that pushed the spiderlings west. Thranduil led through the breach with Iranian's archers behind him, shooting anything grown that tried to come back. The birchwood filled up with clicking and the crack of falling timber. They did not stop until green trees stood round them again. There the ground dropped away sharply, and below lay the marsh hollows. Galleon's company stood on a chain of small islands, ringed by black water and low mist. Spiders moved beneath the reeds, showing nothing but the tips of their legs. Oil burned in floating patches where the clay jars had broken, though the flame drifted with the water and left dark channels between. Thranduil went straight down and asked where the brood was. "All around us," Galleon said. "They will not rise." They were waiting for weight. The king put his sword into the nearest patch of ground, and the moss broke open on web stretched taut beneath the water. Every island was false. He ordered them back to the roots, and the elves withdrew toward the higher bank, and the marsh opened under them as they went. Web floors dropped away in broad circles. Spiders came up through the black water, bodies slick with mud, fangs riding just above the surface. One took an elf by the ankle and had him down to the waist before Galleon cut through the gripping limb. Thranduil reached the bank and turned. Oil on the reeds, all of it. The last jars went wide. Flame ran over the marsh in broken paths, then caught the dry reed heads standing above the water, and the fire crossed stalk to stalk and joined into a roof over the hidden brood. So they rose. They burst out of the marsh in scores, and left the water beneath the burning canopy, and the archers loosed from the bank while spears met the ones that came up through the roots. A great marsh spider went after Galeon with reeds burning across its back. Thranduil stepped into the smoke and struck at the eyes. The creature turned and swept him against a root with one leg. Galeon drove a spear in beneath the body. The spider crushed the shaft and lunged a second time, and Thranduil came up inside the smoke, found the split in its lower shell, and put his sword through it. The thing dropped half in the water and half on the bank. "Keep them moving south," the king said. "Do not close yet." The surviving broods fled the marsh and the birchwood and the ridge almost together. By sunset, all three paths ran into a region where the forest floor rose and sank in long waves. Web lines thickened between the trees. Old bones hung from the branches in silent rows, and ahead of them, the canopy disappeared behind a pale wall that ran farther than sight could follow through the wood. The great nest had been built around an ancient hollow, closed in from ground to crown in woven layers, the trees standing inside it like pillars under a shroud. Black openings marked the lower walls. High up, vast shapes moved behind the silk. Thranduil reached the northern edge as Iranian and Galeon came in from west and east, and the three companies made a broken ring round the hollow. Fewer than 40 warriors were still fit to assault it. Behind the veil, the returning broods were gathering in deep ranks. Lethuin looked along the white wall and said they could not seal all of it. They would seal what the brood would choose, the king said. He walked the northern face and put his hand to the web. Old stuff, thick with dust and sap and the leavings of a great many feedings, with fresh strands crossing it in from every lesser nest. He pointed east and west. 2 roads cut inward, and the southern wall left untouched. Galeon understood first. They will flee from the blades toward Dol Guldur. They would try, Thranduil agreed. Galeon asked what waited there. The king looked at the trees beyond the southern vale, their crowns leaning inward above a deep ravine, choked with dead wood, and said fire. The last light failed. Elves laid resin and dry bark down in the ravine. Archers climbed the outer trees. Axe-bearers took their places before the 2 chosen roads. Thranduil stood at the northern wall, where a vast shadow shifted behind the silk and came to a stop opposite him. A single heavy limb pressed against the veil, and the web stretched outward toward him. He raised his sword. "Open the nest!" The axes struck the northern wall together, and the first blows sank in and stopped dead. The web closed round the iron and held the blades fast. The elves twisted the hafts, tore them loose, and struck again into the same wounds, while Thranduil stood between the 2 assault roads, watching the great shadow press nearer behind the veil. "Hooks above the cuts," he said. "Draw the layers apart." Iron caught the upper strands, ropes tightened, and the pale wall stretched toward the elven line, groaning through every tree it was bound to. Axe heads went into the opened seams and worked downward until the first strip tore loose, and hot air breathed out of the nest, carrying venom and old blood and the dry reek of cast shell. Behind the opening, a passage ran roofed in web and root, wide enough for 3 elves abreast. Spiders crowded it floor to crown, their eyes catching what little light there was in the torchless dark. "Shields forward," Thranduil commanded. "No fire within." The first brood rushed the breach. They hit the bone-armored shields and drove the leading elves back out through the torn wall, spears passing between the shield rims, the narrow mouth filling up with limbs and broken shell and black blood. Thranduil came in behind the first rank. A spider climbed the shield wall and dropped among the spear-bearers, and he cut beneath its raised foreleg, turned in under the body, and opened the softer seam along its side until the creature collapsed across the passage. "Roll it inward," he said. The elves thrust together, and the dead thing went back into the nest, striking the brood behind it, breaking that first press. Over the twitching limbs the shield wall advanced. At the eastern road, Galion's axes opened a second mouth. Aranian widened the western cut with ropes bound round 2 living trunks, and hauled until the silk tore. Each wound, the great nest answered with a different brood. Lean hunters came down on Galion from the upper layers, striking off their cords and withdrawing again before a sword could reach them. Heavy ground spiders met Aranian beneath the roots, heads plated in bone. What came before Thranduil were pale nest guards, swollen at the joints, their forelegs sharpened by ridges of hardened shell. The king drove straight into them, and his order carried over the clicking. Take the joints, leave the bodies standing. Arrows went into the legs rather than the eyes. Spears pinned limbs to the webbed walls. The wounded stayed upright, tangled in one another, a barricade of their own kin, and the young behind them could not come forward. Thranduil cut his path through that living barrier. The passage widened into a chamber, built around 3 ancient oaks, their trunks wrapped so deeply in silk that no bark showed anywhere. Egg sacs hung between them in ranks. Some were small as shields, others were large enough to hold a grown deer, and beneath the pale skins the spiderlings moved. "Cut none," Thranduil said. "Mark the chamber." Lethuin bound a strip of red cloth around the nearest root. The elves passed through without touching the eggs, and 6 warriors stayed behind to hold the entrance. The brood pressed toward those 6, then stopped, checked, it appeared, by some command from deeper in. A pulse ran through the floor. Every egg sac trembled, and the skins split, and the spiderlings came out of the chamber walls in white streams, falling on the rear guard, covering the roots, pouring after Thranduil's company. "Oil behind us," the king said. "1 line only." A jar broke across the marked route. Flame was touched to it, and ran in a narrow band between the 3 oaks, catching the loose silk on the ground, rising no higher than a warrior's knee. The spiderlings rushed into it. The first ranks burned. Those behind climbed over the burning and drove the flame flat beneath their bodies. The elves withdrew through the southern mouth, with the archers shooting into that pale mass, and at the king's word the axes struck the web-bound roots above the entrance. One old limb came down across the passage, then another. Burning spiderlings pressed against the fallen wood from behind, and the smoke followed the elves into the deeper nest. Thranduil did not slow. The next hollow went down beneath the roots. Web had formed steps along the walls, and every step was crowded with shells shed by growing broods, some fresh and soft still, others hardened for years into great empty shapes with jaws longer than knives. Below, the passage divided into 5 black roads. Lethuin knelt and put his hand to the floor, reporting many tracks, all of them inward. And when the king asked which carried weight, the scout laid his palm on each strand in turn, until, at the central road, the web trembled in slow intervals under his fingers. "That one." Thranduil pointed to the others and told them to seal each as they passed. The elves cut the supporting lines and brought the side passages down behind curtains of silk and root. Spiders struck those barriers from within, but the company was already along the central road before the walls could be opened again. Above them, the nest shook under battle. Galion's eastern force drove higher through the woven crowns, cutting web from branch to branch, while Aranian's company advanced beneath the western roots where the ground spiders had built tunnels through black earth. Their distant blows came to Thranduil as dull thunder. The broods were being pressed toward the heart. The central road ended at a bridge. It crossed a deep hollow within the nest, woven between two vast roots grown apart over ages, and beneath it lay a pit of bones, cast shells, and the bodies of spiders killed in older struggles. The bridge was broad. Every strand beneath it had been cut nearly through. Thranduil stepped onto the first pace and stopped there. "They yield the bridge," he said. Lethwin looked across at the empty far side and answered that they would break it when the company reached the center, or before, the king said, and raised his hand toward the crown. "Archers, find the upper anchors." Shafts went up into the dark. 2 struck web, 1 struck wood, and the 4th brought down a thin creature from the root ceiling with a cluster of severing lines gripped in its limbs. It fell alive into the pit. The web bridge tightened at once as hidden spiders hauled from both sides. "Across in 2s, Thranduil commanded. "No halt!" The first pair ran, and the bridge dipped and held. The second followed. By the 4th crossing, the strands were parting along the edges, and then the nest guards came at them from below, climbing the underside, striking up through the weave. One fang went into a warrior's boot and tore him off his feet. Thranduil caught the back of his mail, while another elf cut the gripping limb through the floor. "Keep moving." The wounded warrior crawled, and the line passed over him, and below, the spiders cut faster. Thranduil crossed last, with Lethwin. Halfway over, the bridge snapped at the northern root, and the woven floor dropped from under them. Lethwin seized one of the upper cords. Thranduil caught the broken edge with his left hand, the pit opening below, and the spiders came up the hanging web towards them. The king swung his sword once and took off the first reaching limb. Lethwin drew a knife with his free hand and cut the line beneath a second creature, and it went down among the bones. From the far side, out of the dark, Galion's voice. "Rope!" A hooked line came across. Thranduil caught it round his sword arm, and the elves pulled from the far root, while the hanging bridge tore strand by strand. Lethwin reached the edge first. Thranduil climbed after him as a great spider rose from beneath the broken web, its fangs closing where his leg had been a moment before. He kicked against the lower eye cluster, gained the root, and turned before the creature could follow. "Cut it down!" The axes severed what anchors remained. The bridge went into the pit, and the spiders on it, and half the old shells along the walls with them. The crash rolled beneath the nest. Beyond the broken crossing stood a vaulted hollow lit by cold green fungus, and there the great nest revealed its heart. Trees had been drawn together by cords thicker than a warrior's arm, their trunks bent inward around a central mound of web and bone and dark earth. Tunnels opened at every level. Broods covered the roots in layers, young beneath hunters, hunters beneath wardens, and above them all hung the brood mother, fixed beneath the joined crowns, immense and grey, her swollen body marked with old scars and pale bands. Her forelegs rested on the upper web like the limbs of a dead tree. Beneath her mouth hung strips of mail, antler, splintered bone. Her eyes turned toward Thranduil. The whole hollow clicked once, and every brood moved. They came down the roots, through the tunnels, across the central mound. The first rank was made of wounded creatures driven on ahead from the outer nests, and behind them came the wardens. High above, the brood mother stayed still, sending tremors through the web with each touch of her limbs. Thranduil raised his sword and called them to hold the root. The elves formed at the edge of the broken bridge with the great root as a wall at their backs. Spears met the first rush, Arrows rose toward the upper strands and cut down what was descending from the crown. The wounded brood broke against them, and fresh wardens climbed over the bodies. One struck the shield line and split a bone plate from rim to center. Another drove through the left flank and took an elf in its jaws. Thranduil cut across the mouth, freed the warrior, and took the creature's eye with the return stroke. Gaelion held the east, Lethwin called, and Aranion was beneath them. The king looked toward the central mound and told him to signal both. Lethwin took a white-fletched arrow and shot it into the upper web. A horn answered once from the eastern crown. From below came 3 axe blows upon root. Thranduil pointed to the broodmother. "Drive all lines inward." Gaelion's company broke through the eastern veil above the hollow and came down along the bound trunks, cutting web behind them so the broods could not go back to the crown. At the same moment, Aranion's warriors burst from the ground beneath the western mound, axes opening the lower tunnels. The spiders turned toward both breaches, and their ranks folded inward, and Thranduil struck through the center. Forward. The root line opened into a wedge. Spears drove into the crowded wardens, archers shot over their shoulders into the descending broods, and the elves advanced across the central floor, step by step, leaving dead spiders beneath their boots. The broodmother moved at last. She came down without a cord. Her body struck the central mound and broke it open. Bones, eggs, and black earth burst outward, and 3 elves went down beneath the weight of the fall. The great creature rose over them. Her forelegs swept wide, driving warriors against the roots, and one fang punched through a bone shield and lifted the bearer clear of the ground. Thranduil ran beneath the raised limb and cut through the lower joint. The broodmother turned upon him. Her head was broader than his chest. Old scars crossed the eyes, and broken arrowheads sat buried in the shell, rusted dark from battles fought before any warrior there had been born. She struck. He moved inside the blow and cut at the mouth, and his blade broke one fang near the base. Venom spilled across the web and burned through it in smoking holes. The broodmother reared. Archers loosed from 3 sides. Most shafts broke upon the shell, though some entered the softer plates beneath her body, and she came down upon the eastern company and crushed 2 spiders of her own brood beneath her weight. "Upper cords," Thranduil called. "Take her from the crown." Gaelion's elves cut the great support lines behind her, and the joined trees shifted apart. Web tore from the upper hollow. Whole broods fell from the crown, and the broodmother lost the pull that steadied her body and lurched toward the western mound. Aranion's axes struck her rear legs. One joint opened, then another. She turned with such force that the sweep of her body cast warriors across the hollow. Thranduil was thrown against the central root, and his sword left his hand and vanished beneath the dead. The broodmother came for him. Lethwin loosed into her wounded eye. The shaft entered and snapped, and she struck the scout aside with one foreleg. Thranduil reached beneath a fallen warden and found a broken elven spear bound into its armor, and he tore it free as the broodmother lowered her head. The broken fang opened before him. He planted the spear in the wound. The creature drove forward. The shaft bent. He braced it beneath one arm, set both feet against the root, and held, and the spear point entered through the broken fang and went deeper as her full weight came upon it. The wood split. Thranduil released the shaft, seized his fallen sword from beneath the dead, and climbed the spear as if it were a step. He reached the lower eyes. One cut opened the scar across them. A second entered the wound. The broodmother rose, carrying him upward against her head, and he drove the blade with both hands. The sword passed behind the eye cluster and entered to the brain. The broodmother staggered. Her limbs struck the roots, the mound and the upper web in blind succession, and elves scattered from beneath her. The great body turned once toward the southern wall. Then it fell. The heart of the nest broke under the weight. Web floors collapsed into the lower tunnels, and wardens and young alike vanished with them. The joined trees sprang apart, tearing open the crown, letting the first grey light of dawn fall into the hollow. For one breath, the surviving broods stood still. Then they fled south. Thranduil pulled his sword from the broodmother and raised it toward the ravine beyond the opened wall. "Fire!" The southern line answered. Flame rose outside the nest in a long red arc, took the dead wood of the ravine, climbed the resin laid among the roots, and closed across the spider's chosen road. The fleeing broods struck it in a black mass. Some turned back and found the elves advancing from the heart. Others climbed the walls and were shot from the opened crown. The rest entered the fire and vanished beneath smoke. Thranduil led through the southern breach. He did not stop at the dead broodmother, and he did not turn for the fallen. Sword in hand, he drove the remaining wardens from root to root until the last fighting brood broke against the flame. By full dawn, the great nest was open to the sky. Fire burned only where the king had ordered it. Elves cut living trees free from the dead web and smothered sparks in the moss. Egg chambers were opened and burned one by one, and the lower tunnels were filled with stone. Thranduil stood upon the ruined southern wall. Behind him lay the hollow, blackened and torn. Before him, the wood stretched toward Dol Guldur, beneath a roof of shadow, and far away, beyond sight, a single clicking passed through the trees. No answer came from the conquered ground. Galion approached with blood on his mail and said the northern ring held, and the king told him to strengthen it. Aranion, Galion added, asked where the new watch should stand. Thranduil pointed to the southern ridge above the ashes. There. Lethuin came last, one arm bound against his side, and asked about the dead. The king looked back into the opened nest where his warriors were lifting the fallen from among the roots and said they would carry them north. He descended from the wall and passed among the living. Behind him, the fire sank into the great nest. Ahead, elven axes were already clearing the ground for the watch. To answer for what we burned.